I think I want to read today from the Old Testament in 2 Kings. That is before you get to the Psalms. So if you can open to the Psalms and go backwards a little bit, you'll find 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings. So this is 2 Kings chapter 1. And this is talking about a king in Samaria. And before I read, I guess I need to give a little bit of background what Samaria is. Although we've talked about it before, but just in case, it doesn't hurt to set the stage a little bit. As you all know, Saul was the first king of Israel, and he wasn't a good king. He didn't do things the way the proper way. And when he was killed in battle, David became king. And David was said to be a man after God's own heart. And of course, David's the author of the Psalms. David was a good king. And when David died, his son Solomon became the king of Israel. And he had the reputation of being very wise, though he had 300 wives. So we question his wisdom a little bit there. No, that's just a joke. No, ladies, don't be mad at me about that. I'm just joking about that. But at any rate, when Solomon died, his son was Rehoboam. Rehoboam was not wise. And he was, I guess the best way to say it was a little bit dictatorial, and the kingdom of Israel split. And it was basically over government intervention and taxation and those sorts of things, I guess if you want to boil it down. But none of that, we don't need to get into all that, except to say that the kingdom of Israel split during the time of Rehoboam. And by the time we get to 2 Kings, what we have now is two separate kingdoms. The 10 tribes, of course, Israel was comprised of the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes that trace their ancestry to the sons of the first Jacob, who was called Israel. And so that Judah and Benjamin took the territory to the south. And that's where Jerusalem was. Jerusalem with the temple that Solomon had constructed. The temple of God was in Jerusalem, and that was in the south. Two tribes stayed there, Judah and Benjamin. The northern territory was the other 10 tribes who were mad. And they made their own capital in Samaria and built their own temple. So now there's not only a political division, there's a religious division. There is religious rivalry between these two rival temples. And so the Jews, from which we get that from Judah, comes from, in the south, they despised the Samaritans in the north because they had this rival kingdom and a rival temple. And so this that we're about to read here in 2 Kings is all taking place with those northern 10 tribes in Israel, and it has to do with Samaria. So this is the king in the north, in Samaria. It says in verse 1, "Then Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab, and Ahaziah fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber that was in Samaria, and he was sick. And he sent messengers and said to them, 'Go and inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease.'" Now right away, a couple of questions come to my mind. First of all, what was he doing walking on a lattice? Every lattice I've ever seen, I wouldn't step on it. But anyway, he fell down through whatever happened, he fell down. Second question, though, more important, look at what he says here. He's injured from this fall, and he says, "Go and inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover of this disease." Beelzebub comes from, it's an extension of the name Baal, and that was the indigenous god of the Canaanites in this land. When they came into the land, when the children of Israel came in and took the land, that was the god that they were worshiping, the people that lived there. And they've Beelzebub, the first part of that is Baal. It literally means the Lord of the Flies, which is a really horrible sounding thing. But whatever it's all about, it's a rival god. So he doesn't say go and ask the Lord or go and ask the God of Israel, go find a prophet. He doesn't say that. He says go to Ekron. He's got more confidence in the God of these indigenous people, Beelzebub, Evidently, they had, fortune telling and predicting the future and so forth. So he sends, this is not a good thing, in other words, what I'm saying. Verse 3, but the angel of the Lord said to Elijah the Tishbite, he's the prophet of God. The angel of the Lord said to him, arise and go and meet the messengers of the king of Samaria and say unto them, is it not because there is not a God in Israel that you go and inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Fair question. That makes a good point, isn't it? I think that's pretty polite too, really. Is it because there's no God? Yeah, that's probably the case. He's trying to point that out to him. Verse 4. Now therefore, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. And so Elijah got the message, and he departed, says. Verse 5, when the messengers turned back to him, that is to the king, he said to them, why are you now turned back? In other words, the messengers came right back. They didn't have time to go to Ekron and ask Beelzebub this question. All of a sudden, they're back, and he says, what are you doing here? They said to him, there came a man to meet us, and he said, go, turn again to the king that sent you, and say to him, thus saith the Lord, is it not because there is not a God in Israel that thou sendest to inquire Beelzebub, the god of Ekron? Therefore thou shalt not come down from that bed on which thou art gone up, but shalt surely die. And before we read further, how do you suppose the king felt about this message? Well, I suppose he's probably a little bit angry. First of all, they didn't obey what he told them to do. Second of all, he's got this message now that sort of brings reproach to him. He said to them in verse 7, what manner of man was he that came up to meet you and told you these words? What kind of a person was this? And he says, tell me a little bit about this person that told you this. This is kind of funny in verse 8. They answered him and said, he was a hairy man, and girt with a girdle of leather about his loins. And he said, it is Elijah the Tishbite. What's not here is he said, I thought so. See, oh yeah, that hairy guy. Yeah, Elijah. I guess Elijah kind of was a wild-looking man. So he figured it out right away, just with that little bit of description. Well, let's see. He was a hairy man and had a leather tied around. Okay, I got it. It's Elijah. So now the king is really angry because he sent the messengers back. He countermounted his orders. Number two, what he told them was brought a kind of a reprimand to him. So kings don't like to have contrary information. And the king, here's what he did, verse 9. The king sent unto him a captain of 50 with his 50, and he went, let's see. Yeah, okay. This is to Elijah, that is. So the king sent to Elijah a captain of 50 with his 50, and went to him and said, behold, he sat on top of a hill, and he spoke to him, that is Elijah, and he said, thou man of God, the king hath said, come down. So he sends these soldiers and says, you're coming with us. You got the picture here. He sent 50 guys to arrest him. Now that ought to be enough, you'd think. 50 soldiers, armed men, ought to be able to bring this one hairy man, bring him in. And Elijah answered, verse 10, and said to the captain of the 50, they said, you man of God, come down. He said, okay, if I be a man of God, let then fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. In other words, I'll show you who's boss around here. That's kind of what he's saying. So if you're right, if I'm a man of God, as you say, then let's just have fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50. And there came down fire from heaven and consumed him and his 50. Now, if you go on reading, you find out that the king tried this a couple more times. And then finally Elijah just went to him and gave him the message in person. But here's the thing I want you to see. Fire did come down from heaven. It says so right here in verse 10. It didn't come from the devil. The devil didn't do it. God did it. This represents the judgment of God, this fire that came down from heaven. There's no other way to understand it. It didn't say it came up from hell. It said it came down from heaven. And it's all in the context of demonstrating that Elijah was man of God. So you might read this and get the idea that that's how God operates, that anyone who is contrary to him, he's going to send down judgment. This represents the judgment of God. And you might, it's easy to see how you might draw that conclusion from this passage. Now, if we fast forward a little bit into the New Testament, into Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, we see that Jesus' disciples drew exactly this conclusion. And I'm going to start reading in Luke's Gospel in chapter 9 with verse 51, Torrin. Luke chapter 9, verse 51 says, "It came to pass, when the time was come that he should be received up," that is Jesus, "he steadfastly set his face to go to Jerusalem." Now keep in mind everything I just told you about Samaria and Jerusalem. There is a rivalry. There is a hostility. You know, whenever you read in the Gospels about this hostility between the Jews with Jesus, his disciples, and the Samaritans, that's the source of it. And by this time, it's been long-standing, over hundreds of years. So he is going to Jerusalem because he knows that's where he's got to go. And he sent messengers before his face, and they went and they entered into a village of the Samaritans to make ready for him. So evidently he's crossing through the territory controlled by the Samaritans. It says, when they did not receive him, because his face was as though he would go to Jerusalem, they did not receive him. In other words, they didn't give them lodging, they didn't give them food, they didn't help them in any way. They just, when they came to town, they shut the doors and pulled the shutters down. They didn't have anything to do with them. They showed their disdain for them, evidently. They did not receive him. Verse 54, when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Lord, wilt thou that we command fire to come down from heaven and consume them, even as Elias did?" Now, by the way, the reason it says Elias instead of Elijah, it is Elijah they're talking about. It's because in the first century, the Old Testament that was being used in common circulation was written in the Greek language. It's called the Septuagint. And that's the way that it is in Greek. It's a Greek version of Elijah, because that was the scripture that was in circulation at that time, a Greek version of that's why these words are sometimes a little different. But listen to what they said. They're going to apply the scriptural precedent. We just read about it. In other words, here's how God deals with these Samaritans. We already know. He sends down fire from heaven and burns them up. And they're a little bit mad. In other words, they came to town and the Samaritans wouldn't give them any food, wouldn't inconvenience them. And they were angry about it. And they were saying to Jesus, they haven't changed. They're just like they were back in the days of Elijah. And I'm sure they felt like they had a pretty good case here. And you can see their logic. I think you can understand what the point they're making. They're applying the scriptural precedent. Isn't this how God does things? God's been judging these Samaritans for years now. And so let's just do what Elijah did. Why not? Verse 55, we find out why not. He turned, Jesus, and rebuked them, which is really amazing. He didn't rebuke the Samaritans, he rebuked them, the disciples who said this. And all they were doing, by the way, is applying the scriptural precedent. He rebuked them and he says, "You know not what manner of spirit you are of. For the Son of Man is not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them." And they went into another village. Now I looked up this word destroy, by the way, in the concordance, on Strong's Concordance. And you can do this online now. I've got a big book back there if you're ever interested. You'll have to have a magnifying glass, or at least I do. But you can look up every single word in the King James translation. And this word that's translated destroy is a Greek word, apollymi, A-P-P-O-L-L-Y-M-I. The idea here is not extinction, but ruin or loss is what the idea is. And he says, I haven't come to destroy or to ruin or to cause problems for them. And it represents, the judgment of God, as we've already seen. So I haven't come to do that, Jesus said. Now, this raises an interesting question. Why is Jesus saying it's not appropriate to do what God did in the Old Testament? That was God's judgment. Well, here's why. And this is the key thought that we need to understand. Jesus going to the cross and carrying our sins in his own body was the judgment of God on sin, past, present, and future. It was all focused on that one event. All of his judgment, everything he had in terms of judgment and payment and the consequences of sin, as far as God is concerned, We're all focused on Jesus, on the cross. And because he came to do that, that's the reason why he's saying, we're not going to call down fire from heaven on these people. It's going to come down from heaven, all right, but on me. That's why. I have come to save them, not to destroy them. That ruin and that polemy that's going to fall on Jesus. Now, let's make another Old Testament comparison. This is in Numbers, chapter 21. And let me see here. And Torin, it's verse 4 is where I want to start. Numbers chapter 21 and verse 4. We're going to make another Old Testament, New Testament comparison. Numbers 21, starting with verse 4. Where we're at now in the story is we're a little bit prior to what we had read before about Ahab and Ahaziah and Israel and Samaria. Now we're back even before that, and the children of Israel have been delivered from their bondage in Egypt, and they're on their way to the Promised Land. And on their way to the Promised Land, they had to pass through the wilderness. And in the wilderness, they experienced a lot of frustration and a lot of discomfort and a lot of lack, and there was a lack of food and a lack of water. God sent down manna from heaven, heavenly food. And you'd think that's a pretty good situation because they didn't even have to go to the store and buy it. They just fell in the yard. But they even were so discouraged, they got tired of that heaven, that manna from heaven, that God sent food. And here, let's begin reading with verse 4. They journeyed from Mount Hor by the way of the Red Sea to compass the land of Edom. And the soul of the people was much discouraged because of the way. Now that can happen, not just to them, but to us, to anybody. It's easy to get discouraged. So we can't really find fault with them because of that. That's just a human reaction. They were discouraged. It's easy to understand. I think we all know what it's like to be discouraged, so we can sympathize with them. But here's what they did. They got so discouraged, it says verse 5, the people spoke against God. Now that's probably not the best idea when you just make a little note to yourself. Next time I get discouraged, just stop myself before I start blaming God for it. Because that's what they did. They spoke against God and against Moses. In other words, they were so distraught and discouraged, they were speaking against God, against Moses. And here's what they said. Now you got to kind of read this in a sort of sarcastic tone of voice because this is how they felt. They were bitter, they were unhappy. Wherefore have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Well, that's not really why he brought them out of Egypt, but that's how discouraged they were. For there's no bread, neither is there any water, and our soul loatheth this light bread. That means we're sick of this light bread, this bread that God gave them from heaven. That's how discouraged they were. There's no food, there's no water, and we're sick of this light bread. They're really upset here. They're really, bitter. And the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people and bit the people, and much people of Israel died. Again, just like that, you see fire as sort of a theme here. That fire that came down from heaven and consumed those 50, this represents the judgment of God. There's no other way to understand this. They were doing the wrong thing, and God's judgment came on them. And again, you might, if you didn't take into account anything you read in the New Testament, you might read this. You see, this is by the way, this is a little side thought, not my main thought. This is an extra side thought, no charge for this. This is the reason it's dangerous to just spend all your time in the Old Testament and not put it in the light of the New Testament. Here's what I say. You should always read the Old Testament in light of the New Testament, not the other way around. The New Testament is the reality for us. It has superseded whatever is in the Old Testament. And even though we might not understand everything about how that works, that's the case of the matter. What you see in the Old Testament doesn't necessarily represent the reality that we are living in today, because something has changed between Old Testament and New Testament. That's why there is Old Testament and New Testament. If it were all the same thing, then there wouldn't be old and new. Does that make a logical sense to you? I have friends, good friends, who try to smooth over all those differences and try to make it be all one continuous. There's a word in psychology, maybe you've heard it, called cognitive dissonance. Have you ever heard of that before? Cognitive dissonance means you hold contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time. And that's what makes people go crazy, trying to hold opposite ideas. If you try to smooth over all the everything you read in the Old Testament and the New Testament, make it all one thing, you're going to have a bad case of cognitive dissonance, because you're going to see opposite things going on. You're going to see God doing things in the Old Testament that he no longer does in the New Testament. And one of those is this idea of sending down judgment on people, on nations, on cities, on individuals. This, though, at this point here, this is God's judgment. He sent fiery serpents among the people. The devil didn't do it. It wasn't anything, it didn't come up from hell. God did it. The Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people, and much of the people of Israel died. There's no other way around it. This is the judgment of God. So this got their attention, as you can understand. Therefore, the people came to Moses and said, "We have sinned." They got the message, I guess. "And we have spoken against the Lord and against thee." They knew immediately what they had done wrong. They recognized it now. And I guess, when they were complaining before about how bad things were, now they find out it could be a lot worse than what they were imagining. Anyway, they are recognizing their error, and they said, "Pray to the Lord that he take away the serpents from us." And Moses prayed for the people. And the Lord said to Moses, now get this, here's what he said in response: "Make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole. And it shall come," now you get that it's fiery. The fire, you see, the fire is this little theme here. This represents God's judgment. Do you understand? Can you see that? Is that clear? I mean, I think that's clear. When we saw the fire come down from heaven in the previous example, and here the fiery serpents, that description, fiery, represents God's judgment. "Make a fiery serpent, put it on a pole, and it shall come to pass that everyone that is bitten, when he looketh upon it, he shall live." He offers them, what is he offering them here? He's offering them deliverance. From what? Deliverance from that judgment. He says, here's how it's going to work. You're going to take a serpent, put it on the pole. And when you look at that, everyone that looks to that will live. And Moses made a serpent of brass, and he put it on a pole. And it came to pass that if a serpent had bitten any man, when he beheld the serpent of brass, he lived. Now, I'm sure, and I'm positive of this, they did not understand what this was all about. For them, it's just one of those quirky, strange things. In fact, here's a bizarre thing. If you go on reading a little later, when they finally got to the Promised Land and they built the temple, for a while there, they took that brass serpent and they put it in the temple and they were bringing it offerings. They didn't know what that was all about. They didn't understand what that represented. But we can understand because we have a New Testament explanation. And it's found in John's Gospel in chapter 3. And I'm sure you've read this before, but that doesn't keep us from reading it again. But I want you to get a point here. John's Gospel, chapter 3, and I'm going to begin reading with verse 14. It says, as Moses, this is Jesus talking to Nicodemus, the man who came and said, "We know you've come from God because no one can do the things you're doing except God be with him." And Jesus said, "You must be born again." And he said, "How can a man be born when he's old? Can he enter his mother's womb a second time?" And Jesus said, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh, but that which is born of the Spirit is spirit." Specifying, he's talking about a spiritual situation here, and now he's trying to explain to Nicodemus what he means. Verse 14, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness," we just read that, remember? He's referring to that thing that we just read. "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so, or in the same way, must the Son of Man be lifted up." That's the expression he uses to describe himself. "The same way Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, must the Son of Man be lifted up." Now we understand what the serpent on the pole represented. It represented Jesus being lifted up on the cross. Now, before I go on reading, that's a little bit, the symbolism is a little bit uncomfortable, because he's saying that serpent on the pole, that's me. Now, we don't like to think of Jesus as a serpent, and he's not a serpent. But in that case, what did the serpent represent? Well, the serpent, the fiery serpent, represented God's judgment. Remember that? And Jesus says, just like Moses lifted that up, that's what's going to happen to me. Why? For judgment. That's why. Go on reading. The next verse says, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Now we know that expression from John 3:16, which is the very next verse, where he repeats it again twice. He repeats that same language. That whosoever, see, he says, just like they lifted up the serpent and everybody that looked to the serpent looked at it, they lived. That was God deferred his judgment or transferred it from them to the serpent on the pole. Whosoever believeth in him, that is Jesus. Notice this word perish. This is an interesting thing here. Do you remember when we read about the disciples wanting to call down fire from heaven on the Samaritans, and Jesus said, I have not come to destroy men's lives. I said the word was apolemai, which means to ruin. This is the exact same word that's also translated perish here. Same word, apolemai. It says that whosoever believeth in him should not perish. You see, when Jesus said, I have not come to destroy men's lives, he said that in reference to calling down fire from heaven. I haven't come to bring that judgment to men. He says, it's going to come on me. He said, whosoever believeth in him will not experience that apolemai, that judgment, that ruin. And notice that it doesn't say whoever lives a perfect life, whoever makes no mistakes, whoever is, lives an exemplary life. It just says whoever believes in him, whoever looks to him as the focal point for God's judgment, shall not perish, but have everlasting or eternal life. Now, just so that you know that I'm not stretching at an interpretation here. This is exactly the way Jesus said it himself. If you skip over a little bit to John's Gospel, chapter 12. Oh, I'm saying Torin. It's Troy back there. Sorry, Troy. I've been calling you Torin all this time. It'd help if I'd look up every now and then. This is John's Gospel, chapter 12. What's going on now is, in these latter chapters of John's Gospel, these are the events and things that he said just prior to him going to the cross that we've been talking about. And so he has been talking to the disciples, and some Gentiles came to see him, and a voice came from heaven saying, let's see, what did he say? There came a voice from heaven saying in verse 28, Jesus said, Father, glorify thy name. And a voice came and said, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. Verse 29 said, the people therefore that stood by heard it, that it thundered. And others said, an angel spoke to him. And Jesus answered and said, this voice came not because of me, but for your sakes. In other words, to confirm him. Now look at what he says now in verse 31. This is remarkable, really. He says, now is the judgment of this world. Now keep in mind, this is a 2,000-year-old now. Now is the judgment of this world. Now, if you stop most Christians on the street and ask them, tell me about the judgment of this world, they're going to tell you about something in the future. That's how most people view it. But see, you shouldn't really think of it that way, at least where you're concerned. Now is the judgment of this world. And I don't know any other way to read that except just what it says there. I looked up the word judgment in this verse. It's a word in the Greek language, krisis, K-R-I-S-I-S. It's also in the Scripture translated condemnation, and judgment is a good way to describe it. It just means judgment is what it means. It's a common word for the word that we use when we talk about judgment. Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. Now we know what he means by the prince of this world. He means the devil. And cast out means removed or pushed out, rejected, pushed out. Which, by the way, is an interesting expression. It says, now shall the prince of this world be cast out, or rejected or shoved out the door is really what it's talking about. And that's a good English expression. Earlier in John's Gospel, Jesus said, everyone that the Father gives shall come to me, and he that cometh to me will never be cast out. Isn't that an interesting thought? Same expression, exact same wording. He says, now the devil's going to be cast out. He says, but if you're believing in me, that's never going to happen to you. A lot of Christians think they will. Some Christians think that if they make a mistake or if they make too many mistakes or, do too many things wrong, God will finally reject them. He says, no, that's never going to happen. But here we see the prince of this world is being pushed out of the picture, is the best way to understand that. Look at what it says next, verse 32. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me. You know, sometimes in worship services, the song leader will say, now let's all lift him up, because if we lift him up, he'll draw all men to, as though if we praise Jesus, that's what he's talking. That's not what he means. He doesn't mean a worship service here. When he says, if I be lifted up, he means on the cross. He means like the serpent on the pole that we just read about. That's what he's referring to. And he says, if I be lifted up from the earth, well, just so you know, the very next verse, verse 33. This he said, signifying what death he should die. He means on the cross when he says lifted up from the earth. Now listen to this. Back in verse 32, he said, if I be lifted up from the earth, I will draw all men unto me. Isn't that a peculiar thought, a peculiar expression? In the Greek language, the word that's translated draw literally means, it's a word that means like you're dragging a heavy weight, like pull. You know, you're pulling something really heavy. What he's saying here is, when I'm up on the cross, when I be lifted up from the earth, I'm going to gather up, he says all men, meaning all mankind. I'm going to gather all mankind to myself. For what purpose? For the purpose of judgment. For the sins of the whole world, all the transgressions, all the things that we imagine that God might or should judge other people or us or anybody. His judgment, instead of coming down in fiery judgment like we saw in the Old Testament, like we saw with the children of Israel with the fiery serpents, instead of that, it's going to be all focused in one place on Jesus. All of God's judgment, all of His punishment for sin, all of the wrath, what we call the wrath of God, you read about it in the Scriptures, all of that is going to be focused in one place, in one time, all on Jesus. But He is, at that moment, gathered to Himself all men, so everybody's going to get their judgment here. That's why He said, back in verse 31, now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of this world be cast out. He said it Himself. This is where the judgment is going to take place. Now, as Christians, as those of us, you remember what He said about the serpent, everyone that looketh on Him, looketh on the serpent will be healed. Jesus applied it this way. He said, I'm going to be lifted up in John chapter 3. He said, I'll be lifted up in the exact same way. He said that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life. As believers, as those who believe in Him, we should consider that that was our judgment 2,000 years ago. And there's not any other one, there's not any more in the future, that was it. That was our judgment 2,000 years ago. Now, what He does with people who reject the gospel and who are not Christians, that's His business. You know, I've never been comfortable with Christians who try to put God in a box. Well, He's got to do this and He's got to do that and He's going to send these people to hell. No, I don't think so. I don't know what. It's His business. You don't have to have a doctrine on that. You don't have to figure that out. All you've got to know is that you are standing or in a place of right standing with God and secure in that position because you've put your faith in the sacrifice that He made, in the place where He focused His judgment on Jesus. And you're putting your confidence and your trust in that. So where that leaves us, well, where does that leave us? Well, let's just see. I got one more verse, then I think I'm done. In Colossians chapter 1, you know, the Apostle Paul understood this completely, and this is part of the revelation that Jesus gave to him. And he talks about the cross a lot. That's his main message. In fact, he wrote to the Galatians, and he said to them, he says, you foolish Galatians, before whom the cross was clearly portrayed. He says, I clearly laid it out before you. And he's chastising them for letting that slip from their consciousness. And what they did when they let it slip from their thinking was they began to try to do things to try to make their position with God secure or make it right. Now here's what Paul says about the cross. I'm just going to read one. There's a whole section here where he talks about this, but in chapter 1 of Colossians, let's just get one verse. Verse 22. Well, let's get verse 21. That's a good one too. I like that one. Verse 21, addressing the reader, So you can take this to be you, because he says, and you, who were sometimes alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now hath he reconciled. At one time we were God's enemies, he says, or alienated from God. And it was in our mind because of our consciousness of our wrongdoing. He says, yet now he has brought us together. He has reconciled us. Look at what it says, verse 22. In the body of his flesh through death. Now we're talking about what's the end result? What does that mean for us? In the body of his flesh through death, here's the outcome. With the result that to present you, and that word to present you means, another translation says, so that you may stand in his presence. It's like you might present someone before the king, presenting now so-and-so. To present you holy, unblameable, and unreprovable in his sight. Why? Not because of your doings, not because of your strenuous moral striving, not because of your efforts, not because of your sacrifices, laudable as those may be. You are presented holy in the sight of God because of what he did for you on the cross, by removing everything that would ever disqualify you in the body of his flesh through death, with the result that you are presented before God holy. And you know, the remarkable thing about this is we can't boast about having done anything. I've mentioned this before many times. I guess I like to bring it up, because if you ask a lot of Christians, what does it mean to be holy? There's no telling what you're going to hear. Right, Janet? You're going to hear about don't play cards or don't go to dances, or then a lot, who knows, a lot of trivial things that are really of no consequence. But none of those things make a person holy. What makes you holy is because you put your faith in a Jesus who went to the cross for you and took away, like that serpent on the pole who healed the people, and all they did was look at it. He took away everything that disqualified you. He took the judgment that you deserved. It says that you may be holy. He could have just put a period there, that you may stand in his presence holy. But he also says unblameable. That word means that no charges may be brought in the future. Not only, you see, this is another thing some Christians think, well, okay, I can admit that he forgave me of my sins right up until the point when I became a Christian. Then after that, we're starting on a new page. He's writing them down again. No, he says, not only holy in the terms of he got rid of your sins in the past, present, and future. Unblameable means no further charges may be brought. And this word unreprovable makes that even stronger. It means the absence not only of charges, but the absence of even the possibility of charges. In other words, no charges may be brought against you because there's already been a payment exacted. There's already been a judgment that's already been made. And again, well, I said that was going to be the last one, but I got one more still. Can you be patient with one more? Where does that leave us? Well, here's Paul. I think, Paul the Apostle says that he was caught up into the third heaven. And it says he heard what he called unspeakable words. Now that's kind of strange, isn't it? Unspeakable words. What are unspeakable words? What it means is he heard things that are hard to express. And I think Paul struggled with how to get across to us the magnitude of what it is that he perceived. Here in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 7, this is one I like, that I think he's trying to grapple with that idea. Chapter 2, verse 7 says this, that in the ages to come he might show, now ages to come means future, right? And not only, it doesn't mean just like near future, but ages to come implies eternity in the future. That in the ages to come he might show, that means to reveal or make it plain, the exceeding riches of his grace and his kindness towards us through Christ Jesus. Paul is saying that it seems as though God feels like it's going to take him a long time to, whatever it is we think about his grace and his kindness towards us right now in the present, we've just only got we haven't got the clear picture of it. It's bigger than we are imagining. It's greater than we imagine. It's so far superior to anything we can conceive of. Paul even uses that language. He even says, beyond what we can ask or think. And in fact, it's right here in Ephesians. If we skip over, Troy, to chapter 3, look at verse 20. Paul, I can just sense there that he's struggling, grappling with the language, trying to put across to us an idea that is so big that language can't really contain it. He says, now unto him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly. You see the extravagant language he's using here. Exceedingly, he could have just said abundantly. He could have just said, he can do more than you ask. No, he says exceedingly abundantly, more than you can even dream of or imagine. Now unto him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly, above, not below, above all that we could ask or think. Now, stop right there. We could ask a lot. Is that right? We can think a lot, we think. He says he can do, and see, why is he telling you this? Not just to say, everybody knows God's got a lot of power. Everybody knows that. He's trying to inspire in us a confidence in this God that loved us so much that he sent Jesus to the cross and put all of the judgment that we could ever have deserved on him and freed us from any consideration of that in the future, so that he can now, in the ages to come, show us the exceeding greatness of his love for us. And here he says, whatever it is you could ask him for, whatever it is you could think of, he can do, and he's saying he wants to inspire your confidence that he wants to do and will do. He's trying to get you to believe this, you see, because it's necessary for you to believe it. Now unto him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us. You see, he's at work in us. It's not just something remote from us. According to the power that worketh in us, unto him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus throughout all ages, world without end. That's a peculiar thought, isn't it? That kind of goes against a lot of people's eschatology when he says world without end. But nevertheless, that's what he said. But my main thought is in verse 20. Unto him that is able to do exceedingly abundantly. Now you think about the things we pray about, the things that you might be a topic of prayer for you. Think about it this way. Whatever it is that you're asking God for or coming to God with, or your concerns or your worries or cares, he can do, Paul says, exceedingly abundantly above anything you can even think of, above anything you can even ask for. He puts this into language here. He's telling us this to increase our level of confidence, to inspire our faith, to believe big about God. He loves you so much that he wants to do even more than you're asking for, even more than you're imagining, even more than you're thinking. How do we get him to do it? He doesn't say you have to get him to do it. He just wants you to believe that he hears your prayers and that he is, what his intention is to do more than you're even asking for. It's so much bigger and better than we can even dream of. Okay, I think that's all we have today. And let's all stand up. I think when we all get to heaven someday, we're going to look back and say, man, I wish I'd understood this back then.